So now it's time to talk more about educational aspiration and to investigate what are the reasons why students choose STEM, because if you really would like to pursue effective activities and processes to foster STEM education, we need to have more data about educational aspiration, and we will do thanks to the presentation of our next speaker, who is Federico Biagi, team leader of the Center for Research and Education and Lifelong Learning at JRC from European Commission. So, Federico, if you...
Thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I will be presenting work done not by me, but my colleagues in my team. But as team leader, I'm responsible for their work, so I'm actually proud to present it. It's actually also good work. But before I start, I just want to tell you what the JRC is. So the JRC is Joint Research Center, or Centro Comune di Ricerca in Italian. And it's basically a directorate general, so that it's like a ministry of the European Commission, and it's doing research in various areas. So from nuclear, in fact, it started with Euratom, the Treaty on Nuclear Energy, and then it does research on hard sciences, on vehicle emissions, on soil, on agriculture. But lately it has also moved to research in social sciences. So there are units that do work on the social implications of the digital economy, other units that do work on fiscal policies, other units that do work on territorial policies. There are many units. So in case you're interested, just try to look for the JRC. And my unit is called Human Capital and Employment, and we deal with issues related to education and employment, as the name says. And so let me just move to the presentation. So the title of the presentation is Science Career Plans of Adolescents, Patterns and Trends. And I'm here just as a presenter. The authors are Artur Pokropek, Zsuzsa Blasko, and Joanna Sikora. Joanna Sikora is at Australian National University, and the others are, well, one was because just left, but they were in my team. So let me just show you I just start advertising the work of my colleagues. So there are some papers here. The presentation will be available. In the final format, so if anyone wants to take a look. But these are just a selection of publications that have been published on the field on this issue by these authors. And the last one is the big one, which is the report that the JRC published. So in case you're interested, I just recommend you to read it, and maybe just the executive summary if you're not really into regressions. Let me just start, and there's one in Polish in case you want. I don't even try to read it, okay? Sorry. Let's start from the background. So, actually, let's start even before that. We've been discussing why STEM are relevant in various dimensions. I just want to first start with an example. So without STEM, I wouldn't be talking to this, I wouldn't be using this, that would not be here, this would not be here, this would not be here, the electricity would not be here. So basically, we would go back thousands of years in terms of technological progress and standards of living. So if we can afford the standards of living we have today, it's because of STEM, mostly. So that's the first thing we have to keep in mind. So it's essential for growth. And good employment. That's a clear message. And we have to remember that. Because when we we make scenarios of what the future needs will be for STEM occupations. Now, it's not really easy to make a prediction of what is the future need for STEM. Maybe you can make it 3-4 years from now. But if you look 20, 30 years from now, we don't really know, in the sense that technological progress is endogenous, depends on what people choose now and will do in the next 10 years. Facebook was non-existing 20 years ago. and it's now one of the top companies in the world. Apple was not going that well. Google was not existing. So things have changed dramatically in 20 years, and we don't know where we're going to be in 20 years. But we know that wherever we're going to be, it's going to be because of STEM. And so it's important that we realize that we are the creators of our future. And future will, a lot depends on STEM. And it's important then to understand whether there are good returns to STEM in the labor market, and the evidence says that yes, there are good returns to STEM in the labor market. You earn more, you have better possibilities of being employed in a good job. That's clear, all the evidence says this. Still there are differences across countries, so the returns are not the same. And you will see in a moment, the desire to go into a STEM career, it's not something that is homogeneous in Europe. Actually, you will see that there are huge differences. So trying to understand what is driving those differences is one of the things that really drove us to work in this area. And so basically, now, if this is the objective, that is to have more people working first, getting a job, and possibly a good job, which means that is creative, well-paid, interesting, and so on, we have to start earlier. We have to look at what determines the choices in the family and at schools. All these will determine career expectations. And so we want to study the link between family, school, and then later on work, which is not something we do here, okay? Here we actually look at expectations of work. We don't actually look at choices made by people. So, why are career plans of adolescents important? First, because they tend to reflect academic achievement, skills, self-beliefs, and motivations. But even more important than that, because they are self-fulfilling prophecies. That is, if you don't expect to go in STEM when you're 15 years old, it's quite unlikely that you will actually do that when you're 18 or 19. So there are people who expect and then don't go, but the reverse, it's very unlikely. And there is a lot of evidence showing that, in fact, this is the case. Because the career expectations are good predictors of future educational and occupational careers. Now, when we think of what determines the choices, we know that the family is important, and we've been talking about role models and family role models before. And we will see that, yes, indeed, they are important. But there are also aspects, but the family cannot be really changed by policies. I mean, family is what it is. Maybe in 30 years you can change, but not in the present generation. So you have to operate on other drivers. So we have to think of what policies can the European Commission, the member states, the schools, the teachers put in place so as to increase the number of people, of students moving into STEM. And we will see actually increase in the number of girls going into STEM, because that's really, as was expressed before, one of the main issues. So this, I think I don't need to replicate this because it's been said already. So what do we do in this work? We take the PISA data. PISA data are from a program, from an OECD program called the Program for International Student Assessment. Basically, this is a study that goes on in many countries, not only European, and it records a lot of information from the students, from the teachers, from the school principals about how things are going in school. But again, school for 15 years old, so the target is upper secondary school, okay? And it also does test. That is, it tests your abilities, students' abilities in various areas. It does it in readings, in math, in science, and in digital competences. And every 3 years, they rotate the main subject of the survey. So it's very interesting because it's designed to give comparative information and representative information across countries. So for us, given that we have in mind a European framework, is a really interesting tool. And what is interesting is that we have two surveys. Well, it was first performed in the year 2000, okay, just for you to know. And we have two surveys that we can use in 2006 and 2015 on science, okay? Now, having said this, there is an interesting question in the PISA questionnaire which asks, what kind of job do you expect to have when you are about 30 years old? And then you're supposed to write the job title. So, based on the answers here, it is possible to categorize the expectations of these students. And what we did is basically, what my colleagues did was basically to create 4+1. I didn't mention it here, but I will mention it in a moment. So we have science and engineering professionals, so the top professions in science and engineering, information and communication technology professionals, and then you have science and engineering associate professionals and information and communication technicians. So these two levels are, in a way, lower professions. These are higher level professions. And then on the side we have medical profession. So we did not treat them all together, okay? So this is a list, the actual list of type of occupations that fall under those categories. So the description of the specific list of occupations. I'm not going to go through them. I mean, they're there if you want to read them later. Okay, so the first thing we notice is that in Europe, about 20% of 15 years old students plan to go in a career that is science related. However, when you look at cross-country variability, you have values going from 12 to 27%. So a lot of variation within Europe. And the second one is that career plans are clearly gendered. The difference between males and females is really high. The average gender gap is 19 percentage points, which means that European males are 3 times more likely to choose a STEM occupation than European females. That's a big number. And a gap favoring males is present in every member state, okay? With a minimum of 15 and a maximum of 31 percentage points. So really big differences. And you can see it here. I mean, unfortunately, the view is not perfect because of the light and so on, but basically think of the darker blue is STEM professionals and the lighter blue is STEM associate professionals. And we present here the sum of the two. And for each country, the first entry is males and the second one is females. So for each country, you have both males and females. And what you notice is that there is not a single country where females are dominant in the expectation to go into STEM. STEM excluding health here, okay? So I'm excluding health profession, medicine. It's not part of STEM in this definition. I will have an information on medicine or health related in a moment. So, and then the differences are big and they are significant statistically. Then when we actually move to health professionals or health associate professionals, so again, top professions, middle, low professions, the gap is completely reversed. So that's an interesting thing. So in health, it's actually women that, or females that are much more likely to go into that profession. But when we sum the two, actually, in most cases, we see that, I mean, Denmark is a bit different, you can see here. But in most countries, the gender gap appears once again. So if you include engineering, ICT plus medicine, we are back to the gender gap. And there is no reason why there should be a gender gap, as we said already. So then we start to try to understand what are the factors that can explain the gender gap. Now, in economics or in social sciences, what you do is you choose a variable which is your dependent variable, what you are trying to explain, and then you use other variables that are the independent variables that are supposed to explain the behavior of the dependent variable. And so we have different variables. For instance, the first one is the science literacy. So how good you are in science. Is that a good predictor of your desire to become a scientist? We will see. gender, male, females, the family background. Are you from a kind of rich family or not? So that's expressed with a variable which is called economic, social, and cultural status in the OECD. And then we also ask things about attitudes towards science. And there is a measure which is called self-efficacy, and basically it measures how confident you are in science. So it's how you rate yourself, not the test. We have an objective measure, but also a self-reported measure. And then we have enjoyment of science. Do you enjoy science? And then we also introduce, I will not give you the full list, but we also introduce country-level variables that are supposed to capture differences across countries that maybe can try to explain the fact that different countries have very different average performance. One thing we notice, this is the relationship between the percentage of STEM careers. So I hope I'm not sounding too scientist here, but on the vertical axis here, you have the percentage of how many 15 years old students are looking forward for a STEM career. And this is the HDI index, which is basically a human development index, an index of how developed the economy is. Interestingly enough, we find that the countries which are on a lower, in countries that are low in level of human development index, that is, they're less developed, basically, the percentages of going into STEM are higher. The difference between the left and the right is that here we do not control for all these other variables, so we just take basically the raw data, and here we control for all the other variables that could determine that. So you can think of this as a stronger result than this, basically. Okay, this is what you really should be thinking of. So basically, it looks like in poorer countries or less developed countries, STEM is really attractive. It looks like an attractive career for social mobility. By the way, I didn't mention, STEM are very important for social mobility. That is the fact that your chances in life are not determined by the family you come from. That's very important, because if you go in STEM, you get a good job and you get a good career. Where you come from, it's not really relevant. Okay, so you can think of this in these terms. Now, when we look at science literacy, we can see what this is saying. So the higher is the level of science literacy, so the better you are in science, okay? And the more likely you are to express a desire to go in STEM. However, there is a gap between females and males. There is a gap, and the gap increases. So the more literate you are in science, and the more the gap grows. We didn't expect that. So what this means is that by simply increasing the literacy in science, you will not solve the gap, most likely. You need something else. Literacy is not sufficient. What about role models? Well, in this case, role models we capture here. No, sorry, that is the next one. This is, I cannot really read very well from close. So self-efficacy and enjoyment of science. So self-efficacy doesn't seem to be, so how good I am in science doesn't seem to affect very much the probability, but still there is a gap between males and females. And about enjoyment, yeah, both are very important, but again, the gap persists. It's not like with the enjoyment of science, the difference is reduced. The difference stays the same. Now, here is father and mother in STEM. So interesting. So this is how the probability that you choose to go into STEM depends upon your father being in STEM or your mother being in STEM. What it shows here is that your father being in STEM really increases the gap between males and females. So it means like a father role model seems to be more important than a female role model, which is not something we expected. But in fact, it seems to be quite a common finding in the literature. And this is basically, forget about the box, what this is saying is simply the fact that whether in the curriculum there is a mandatory exam on mathematics at the end of high school, so which means you are forced to study math until the end of high school, well, that increases significantly the chances that you are interested in pursuing a science career. And then another interesting thing is that vocational orientation, so basically whether you are in a vocational school or not, it seems to be, no, the more vocational is your school and the more is the likelihood that you will express a desire to go into STEM. So there is something in vocational schools that makes you go closer to science, to the practice of science probably. What are our main conclusions? So from our analysis, we conclude that it's important to improve the students' abilities in science because that's key. It's one of the main issues in terms of raising the interest in STEM occupations. However, as I said, this will not likely close the gap. It will increase the interest, but don't ask also to close the gap. Making science more enjoyable, it's likely to work well. Role models, especially parents, are an important source of motivation. Having a standardized compulsory mathematics test at the end of secondary education can help in keeping students in science. However, the gender gap will not easily decrease because boys tend to be more responsive to these variables. Girls with similar profiles compared to boys tend to choose medical occupations. One thing that we also find, which I didn't mention, is that early tracking, which means that basically educational system that leads students to choose very early in their student life. So when you have early selection that selects students into STEM-related programs before age of 15, tends to widen the gap. So what does it mean? It means that if you ask students to choose what you want to do when you are 13 or 14, boys tend to go more in STEM than girls. It's like they drop out early. So from an early age, we think that it would be very important to avoid exposing children to gender stereotyping in the area of education and STEM particularly. Many thanks for your attention. I hope I was clear enough. Thank you.
Thanks to Federico Biagi for all this data. Sometimes all this data can be, we can see this kind of data as counterintuitive because there are very surprising results, but I think it's very nice to have to discuss with all the audience later on this data together with Federico Biagi and the other keynote speaker.